The sun above Ophelia. 7 bled a crimson light across the spires of the Basilica Imperialis, its dying rays casting long shadows through the cold halls of the Adepta Sororitas. The sacred bells that once tolled every hour now hung in silence, unmoving even in the presence of wind. Dust gathered on ancient gold, and incense no longer masked the scent of rust, ash, and forgotten prayers. The world was not dead, not yet, but it was waiting for something. A reckoning, a silence deeper than death. This was how the age ended, not in fire, not in rapture, but in the slow and sacred crumbling of certainty. One by one, the stars of the segmentum obscurus were fading. Some were consumed by the warp. Others simply vanished, swallowed by silence. Across the galaxy, faith once unshakable now trembled. Yet here, on Ophelia 7, the Sisters of Battle stood unmoved. Or so the outside believed. But inside the vaulted cloisters of the convent prioris, Canoness Veritas Mevelian stared into a flame that did not warm her. She had lit the candle herself, just as she had done every morning since her novitiate more than 3 centuries ago. A ritual meant to affirm belief. Yet as the flame danced, she saw in it something she had never dared acknowledge before. Doubt, not blasphemy, not rebellion, just a quiet, gnawing question. Was he still listening? Welcome, traveller. As we open this tale of fire, silence, and fading stars, know this. We tell it not merely to recount the fall of a bastion or the silence of its saints. We tell it because we truly love and care for you, and in this sorrowful tale, you may find peace. A story sung with ashes is still a story worth hearing. So before we begin the journey, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now, grab your coffee, and let's begin. Mevelian's hand tightened around her rosarius. The golden emblem of the Aquila pressed deep into her skin, leaving an indent she would not notice until later. Around her, the inner sanctum was empty. Statues of St. Aspera and St. Arabella loomed overhead, their marble eyes cast down in eternal mourning. Behind their gazes, Mevelian felt judgment, or perhaps disappointment. She stood beneath their gaze, not as a warrior, but as a weary soul, burdened by too many remembered screams and too few victories that had truly mattered. She turned as the echoing steps of Sister Superior Hystera approached from the far corridor. "Canoness," Hystera said, her voice as disciplined and sharp as always, but with a softness beneath, a shadow of concern. "The envoy from Terra has arrived. He requests immediate audience." Mevelian nodded slowly, her lips drawn tight. "Of course he does." As she followed Hystera through the silent stone passageways, memories stirred like dust. Her first battlefield on the plains of Gracchus Prime, where she baptized herself in fire and blood, the burning of the heretic priest Mazarin, the cleansing of Hive, Tertius, where she had given the order to seal 3 million souls beneath rubble, claiming mercy in the act. She had once believed these deeds were righteous, but with every decade, with every new war, she began to wonder whether justice was merely another word for obedience. The envoy waited in the Hall of Saints, a massive chamber lined with the ossified remains of martyred sororitas, each encased in glass, each skull inscribed with verses of litanies of purity. The man stood in simple black, no rosette upon his chest, no sigil declaring his role, but his eyes gave him away, cold, empty, calculating. A man who served a greater fire than any candle could match. "Canoness Veritas," he said without bowing. "I come bearing directive emberglass, sealed under the sigil of the High Lords." Mevelian took the data scroll with gloved hands, breaking the wax with a ceremonial dagger. The words glowed faintly as she read, and with each line her jaw stiffened. The directive was clear. A known dissenter, Sister Dialogues Elanthi, was to be taken into custody, interrogated, and, should sufficient doubt be confirmed, subjected to cleansing. No trial, no ecclesiastical hearing. The orders bypassed even the prioress general. On whose authority was this issued? Mevelian asked, her voice calm, even. The envoy's lips curled slightly. Authority is not asked for, Canoness. It is recognized. Obey the directive. That is all he left before she could answer. Not that it mattered. That night, Mevelian stood alone in the reliquary of the Blade Eternal, her hands resting on the hilt of her chainsword as it hung before the statue of Saint Dominica. The silence pressed in around her like a second skin. Sister Elanthi had never spoken out loud the things that now painted her as a heretic. But in her writings, in her questions, in the gentleness with which she spoke of the Emperor, not as a god, but as a grieving father, there were dangerous seeds, and yet Mevelian remembered the girl's eyes, so full of compassion, so full of terrible understanding. Was she to be extinguished because she dared to mourn? That night, the stars above Ophelia 7 seemed dimmer than ever before. Mevelian returned to her cell and stared at the candle. The flame still burned, but now it flickered, shivering in a wind that was not there. She did not sleep. She sat in silence, unmoving, as the bell of St. Lucilla refused to toll midnight. In that unholy quiet, Mevelian realized something. Silence was no longer sacred. Silence had become a question, and in the eyes of the Imperium, questions were a sin. The morning bells did not toll. Again. On the second day of Ophelia's new silence, the sisters rose as they always had, disciplined, armored in faith. But something had changed. The morning prayers were not sung in perfect harmony. The candles did not seem to burn as brightly. In the refectorium, where scriptures were once recited aloud between bites of consecrated bread, there was only the sound of cutlery tapping against metal. Eyes lingered longer than necessary. Some searched the stained glass windows for guidance. Others looked only at their plates. Even silence has a sound when it is unnatural. Canoness. Mevelian stood at the edge of the inner cloisters, looking out over the central courtyard where white-helmed novices walked the pattern of repentance around the bones of Saint Valessa. The sun was high but dim behind a veil of grey, ash-streaked clouds. A kind of spiritual corrosion hung over the convent. She could feel it in her bones, like rot beneath polished steel. The directive from Terra still rested untouched on her lectern. She had read it once. That had been enough. Elanthi was no threat. And yet, to the Inquisition's cold calculus, a question was worse than a sword. Canoness, came a soft voice from behind. Might I speak freely? Mevelian turned to see Sister Dialogus Elanthi standing beneath the archway. She was young, but not naive. Her eyes were calm, the way deep waters are calm before a storm. She held no weapon, only a tome, bound in dark leather and laced with prayer seals. You may, said Mevelian after a pause, but understand the price. Elanthi bowed her head. I already do. They walked together beneath the cloister arches, silent for a time. Wind stirred the edges of Elanthi's robes, tugging gently at her parchment scrolls and purity seals. Mevelian watched her with quiet calculation, trying to reconcile the girl's serenity with the fear her presence stirred in the ecclesiarchy's heart. I've been dreaming, Elanthi said at last. Many dream. Few remember. But I remember, Elanthi continued, glancing up at the high colonnades. I dreamt of the throne. Not as it is, but as it was before the Golden Age. I saw him, not as a god, but as a man. Wounded, alone. Screaming without a voice, Mevelian stopped walking. You speak dangerously. I speak what I saw, Elanthe said softly, meeting her gaze. And perhaps what he wants us to see. The canoness's fingers tightened around the hilt of her rosarius. There had been a time when such words would have earned instant reprisal. But now the silence of the stars echoed the silence of the throne, and Elanthe's dreams were not hers alone. Other sisters had come to her in whispers, quiet confessions, visions, mourning hymns in unknown tongues. Mevelian said nothing. Instead, she gestured for Elanthe to follow. They descended into the deeper cloisters, down past the ossuary, through halls forgotten by all but the most ancient records. Here, beneath the convent's bedrock, was the Hall of Fractured Saints, a place not visited since before the age of apostasy, a place where relics of censured orders and controversial martyrs were sealed away, neither condemned nor blessed, only remembered. Elanthe looked around in reverence. I didn't know this place existed, few do, said Mevelian. I was shown it once by a dying prioress who had grown weary of fire and fury. She told me that truth does not burn, it only hides. They walked past fractured statues, some of sisters with faces worn smooth by time, others with inscriptions etched out by decree. One plinth stood bare, its occupant removed entirely, its name carved away so deeply that even the stone wept dust. These were the silent martyrs, Elanthe whispered, her eyes wide. I thought they were a myth. They lived. They died. They sang without words, and the ecclesiarchy called them dangerous Mevelian, stopped before one statue, half cracked, the upper face missing, but its hand still outstretched as if offering something. A fragment of blackened parchment clung to its wrist. She turned to Elanthe. Do you still believe in him? Elanthe didn't hesitate. Yes, but not as they do. Then how? As the emperor who broke himself for us, who gave all and was left entombed, never to speak again. I don't worship his strength, I mourn his silence. Mevelian closed her eyes. A memory surfaced, of fire raining down on the cathedral steps, of her sisters dragging wounded bodies through the rubble, chanting liturgies with broken voices, of the emperor's name screamed into the heavens as the world fell apart. And in that moment, she had heard no reply, no divine reassurance, only the sound of burning, and yet she had carried on, not out of faith, but duty. I fear, she said at last, her voice low, that I have served the corpse and not the man. A moment passed. Then Elanthe reached forward and placed the tome in Mevelian's hands. I want you to read this, she said. It's not a heresy. It's a prayer, just one written for the part of him that died on the inside. Mevelian held the tome like a wound she was afraid to open. A chime echoed faintly through the stone, an alert tone, distant, mechanical. Not a bell, not a choir, but the vox. Mevelian's breath caught. It was Sister Hestera. Canoness, the envoy has returned. He brings agents. They request Elanthe's presence. Immediately, Mevelian looked to the girl, calm, not afraid, only expectant. What will you do? Elanthe asked. I do not know. I do. Elanthe turned and walked toward the stair. Her steps were slow, but sure. Not of one facing execution, but of one answering a calling long deferred. Mevelian did not stop her. And in that moment, as Elanthe disappeared into the shadows above, the canoness realized that silence was not only a question. Sometimes it was an answer. The silence deepened. The bells did not toll. And somewhere, beneath the earth, a forgotten statue extended a broken hand to no one. The rain fell over Ophelia's 7 like ash from a world already judged. It clung to the marble statues and the stained glass saints with a quiet vengeance, as if trying to scrub the holy facade from the bones of the convent priores. Outside the Basilica Sanctifica, the cobbled stones were slick with the oily runoff of sacred oils and machine-blessed incense. Even the air had begun to feel heavy, thick with things unsaid. Canones veritas. Mervelian stood in the chapel of the penitent flame, her eyes fixed on the pyre where Elanthi's name had once been inscribed. It had been wiped clean. The chapel was empty save for one figure, Inquisitor Atraxis. He stood as he always had, shoulders rigid, eyes precise, his robe barely stirring though the wind passed through the open archways. His arrival had not been announced. He never required permission. "I thought you were dead," Mervelian said, not turning. "I often am, by the time I arrive," Atraxis replied, with a voice that could pass as dry parchment over bone. "It keeps things manageable." She finally faced him. The same scar traced his brow, the same void steel band on his right hand, his sigil of truth, forged in blood during the purging of Krytha's well. He had once been her mentor. Once. Now he was something else. "You've read the directive," he said. "I have." And yet, the girl still breathes. Mervelian crossed the chapel slowly, her rosarius swinging softly against her chest. "Tell me, Atraxis, how many innocents have you burned so that one heretic might not escape?" He tilted his head. "I no longer count." "That is your job." A long silence passed between them. Not the silence of peace, but of accusation held at the edge of a blade. "I protected her," Mervelian said finally, voice low, "because I see in her the same thing I once saw in you, a mind too sharp for its own salvation." Atraxis's expression did not change, but something in his stance shifted. "Faith is not built on questions, Mervelian. It is built on obedience. Then what becomes of those who obey without understanding? They become saints." She looked away. "Or monsters." Later that night, beneath the chapel's lower vaults, Mervelian descended alone into the chamber of the flame entombed. This was a place even her sisters did not know well. Once, it had been a crypt. Now, it served a different purpose. A library of forbidden relics, those salvaged from heretical inquisitions, purged cults, and burned archives. Few texts remained in full. Most were fragments, sealed behind armored glass, watched by silent cherubim whose eyes no longer glowed. She passed shelves of broken litanies and tomes stitched in skin, until she came to a low iron case set into the wall. Its lock was a combination she had memorized, then sworn never to use. She broke her vow with steady fingers. Inside was a single relic, a blood-black journal with a brass clasp in the shape of a weeping skull. It was the Codex of Inquisitor Atraxis, Volume 1, before his transformation, before his soul had hardened into sanctioned ruthlessness. She had kept it, hidden all these years, even as he burned libraries and silenced sects in the name of the throne. Opening it was like opening a tomb. Each page was scorched at the edges, the ink fading like regret. She flipped through the early entries, looking for the one she remembered, the one that had haunted her. "I have seen a truth the ecclesiarchy dares not speak, that to preserve his memory, we have entombed him in lies. Faith has become a mask, not a mirror, and those who remove it are executed before they can scream." Mervelian closed the book with a shaking hand. She remembered that Atraxis, the one who had once dared ask what others would not, the one who held her hand when their squad fell to play cultists on Varela, the one who once looked to the stars not with control, but with awe. She remembered the last day they were allies. It was on Golgotha Prime, during the Firestorm campaign against the apostates of the Second Dawn. The Order of the Radiant Blade had followed Atraxis's lead in burning an entire cathedral city. The screams of the dying were called a chorus of purification. Mervelian had found him afterward, standing alone amid the ash, holding the hand of a burned child who had clutched a toy Aquila until her final breath. She was faithful, Mervelian had said. So was the priest who told her heretics lived next door, Atraxis had replied, his eyes hollow. That night, he stopped asking questions. Now, he had become the sword that once trembled in doubt. When Mervelian returned to her quarters, a flickering hollow-seal blinked at her door. Emergency summons from the Prioress General. Inside the High Assembly Hall, 12 sisters sat in stern silence. The Prioress stood at the head, face pale, voice brittle. Canoness Mervelian, she said, you are summoned to answer accusations of negligence and disobedience regarding Directive Emberglass. Mervelian bowed, her voice composed. I read the directive. I obeyed where it did not violate the spirit of our order. You protected a dissenter. I shielded a sister in crisis, as our creed demands. A murmur stirred among the assembled. One of the older sisters, a woman of steel grey hair and eyes like sharpened mirrors, rose. We do not question terror. And terror, Mervelian said softly, no longer hears us. Silence fell. The Prioress's eyes narrowed. Then you admit your actions. I admit only that I listened where others condemned, that I preserved what might still be redeemed. You will stand trial at dawn. Mervelian turned to leave, but paused. Before then, may I see her? The Prioress hesitated. Then finally, 1 hour. Elanthe sat in the oubliette beneath the chapel of Saints Unspoken. Her hands were chained, her lips dry from thirst, but her eyes, those remained full of stormlight. Mervelian entered quietly. You came, Elanthe whispered. I should not have, Mervelian replied. Then why did you? The Canoness knelt beside her. Because I have failed too many already. Elanthe leaned forward. It's not too late. There are others like me, like you. This silence, it's not death. It's a transition. He doesn't speak anymore because he weeps. Tears burned in Mervelian's eyes, but she turned away. If I let you go, she whispered, others will burn. And if you don't, you will. A long pause. Then Elanthe smiled. A sad, holy thing. Then let me burn, Canoness. But do not lie to yourself about why the hour passed like a lifetime. And as Mervelian left the cell, her armor felt heavier than ever. That night, the flame in her quarters refused to light, and above Ophelia 7, a single star flickered, then vanished from the sky. Beneath the Basilica Imperialis, deeper than even the bones of saints or the coffins of canonesses long dead, there lay a chamber forgotten by most of the Imperium and guarded not by faith, but by silence. It was here, in the old catacombs once used by the Choir Quietus, that Sister Dialogus Elanthe was taken, not as a guest, not as a criminal, but as a silence to be smothered before it bloomed. The chamber smelled of ancient oil and sacred decay. Symbols of the imperial creed lined the walls, but they were faded, blurred by time and tears. Once, this chamber had echoed with the harmonious chants of the choir that calmed the warp, a choir of psyker children trained by the Adepta Sororitas to sing their souls in unison and still the storms that ravaged space. But when the warp surged and the Astronomicon dimmed, the choir had been silenced. Not dismissed, silenced. Some whispered that the sisters themselves had wept as they euthanized their beloved children. Elanthe had studied this place in the archives. Now she stood within it, hands bound in prayer chains, not as a scholar, but as a question the Imperium wished to erase. "Do you know why you are here?" asked the Inquisitor. Not the envoy from Terra. Number. This one wore no face. His mask was smooth porcelain, shaped in the likeness of a weeping angel. From behind it came no breath, only words cold and sharp as surgical steel. Elanthe said nothing. The Inquisitor stepped closer. "You wrote, 'Perhaps he waits not to be worshipped, but to be understood.' A dangerous thought." Heretical still, Elanthe was silent. "I have read your annotations, your exegeses. You speak of the Emperor as if he suffers. Her voice, when it came, was soft. Does he not? Did he not give up his body for mankind? Does he not see every atrocity we commit in his name? Tell me, Inquisitor, would you not weep too?" The silence that followed was deep and strange. Not mere absence of sound, but something weightier. The kind of silence that fell before cathedrals burned. "I ask again," the Inquisitor said, quieter now. "Do you repent?" Elanthe looked past him, toward the mural above the ossified remains of the choir. Children holding hands in death, their lips still parted in eternal chant. "I do not repent. I grieve. That was when the blade struck, not to kill, not yet." The Inquisitor's sword, thin and ceremonial, drew a single line of blood down her cheek. "We shall see how long that grief endures." High above, unaware of what judgment unfolded beneath, Canoness Mevelian stood before the Prioress General and her inner circle. Sister Hestera stood beside her, the tightness in her jaw betraying more than discipline. Behind them, the bells still refused to ring. The Prioress General was a towering presence, her armour anointed with relics from 24 battlefields. Her voice was iron, but not unkind. "You received the directive emberglass," she said, "and yet you delayed." Mevelian inclined her head. "I delayed only long enough to verify the charges. The charges do not require verification, only obedience." A long pause. "Do you believe Sister Elanthe guilty of heresy?" asked one of the elder canonesses. Mevelian's eyes did not waver. "No." A ripple moved through the chamber. "She speaks in poetry, yes, but the saints often did. She mourns, but so did Saint Celestine. She doubts, but even the Emperor questioned before Terra's skies burned. She speaks of a God who grieves," hissed another, "who suffers. That is not doctrine." "Perhaps doctrine is incomplete," Mevelian replied softly. The silence that followed was no longer sacred. It was political. When the council dispersed, the Prioress General did not move. She studied Mevelian for a long moment. "You walk a dangerous line," she said. "There are eyes upon us, upon you, and not all of them are mortal." Mevelian bowed her head, then let them watch. That night, she returned to her cell. Her candle still burned, but the wax had begun to pool unnaturally. As though the flame itself wept, she sat, staring into it, until Sister Hestera entered without knocking. "She's still alive," Hestera said, voice low. "They haven't broken her." "She won't recant," Mevelian whispered. "No, she believes too deeply. That's why they fear her." Mevelian nodded slowly. "Then we must decide." "Decide what? Whether we are daughters of obedience or sisters of truth?" Hestera blinked. "You would defy the Inquisition." "I would defy silence," Mevelian said, rising. Far below, Elanthe bled. Yet in her mind, she sang, not with voice but with memory. She remembered the songs of the choir quietus. She had studied their notes, their harmonies, their sacred melodies woven into warp-calming rituals. Now, in the dark, she hummed them without breath, and something heard her. For a moment, the stone beneath her feet trembled, not from machinery, not from footsteps, but from presence. The walls pulsed. The mural above shimmered faintly, and the air grew cold. Something in the size dark remembered the children who once sang here. Something that had not forgotten them. Something mourned with her. And the silence recoiled. There are prayers carved so deep into stone that even when the basilica crumbles, their echoes remain. In the chapel of Black Veils, the most solemn sanctuary within the convent sanctorum, such prayers were offered not in hope of answers, but in acknowledgement of silence. This was where Sisters of Battle came to weep, not for themselves, but for those the Emperor never saved. It was here that Canoness Mervelian stood alone, bathed in candlelight that flickered like a dying soul. The frescoes around her depicted scenes of righteous war, martyrs ablaze, heretics broken, Xenos slain in oceans of blood. But above the altar, one painting stood apart, a sister kneeling before the golden throne, her hands outstretched, not in victory, but in desperate plea. The Emperor sat unmoving, his face, as always, hidden. Mervelian stared into that silence. She whispered, "Why do you not answer us?" Behind her, Sister Hestera entered with reverent steps. Her armor was still marked with the ashes of her morning penance. "The chamber is sealed," she said, "but not unbreakable." Mervelian did not turn. "She does not have long," Hestera added. "No," Mervelian said. "They will not allow a martyr to grow from this. She's already become one." A long pause. Mervelian's voice trembled. I heard her words. Not just the words they accused her for, but the ones she said when no one else was listening. She believes the Emperor weeps for what we've done in his name. "And you?" Hestera asked. "I believe," Mervelian said, "that faith without mourning becomes cruelty. And we have become cruel." Hestera knelt beside her. Together they bowed their heads, not in certainty, but in grief. Beneath the convent, where the air was too thin and the stones too old to remember warmth, Elanthe lay shackled. Her lips were cracked. Her mind flickered between clarity and fever. But the melody remained. In the deep places, she had begun to hear something. A resonance, like voices lost to time returning through the cracks in reality. Echoes of the choir quietus. Children singing not for war or wrath, but for peace, for stillness, for the Emperor's mercy. Each note she remembered hummed through the marrow of her bones, and the walls responded. The silence, once so heavy, began to fray, not broken, not shattered, but stirred. The Inquisitor returned. Today he did not wear the mask of the angel. His face was a face now, pale, unmarked, eyes sunken not with age but with burden. He stood before her and spoke without venom. "You're awakening something, sister." Elanthe said nothing. "Not power," he continued, "not psychic force, but grief, a kind of ancient sacred sorrow." At that, she looked up, slowly, carefully. "You feel it," she whispered. "I feel something," he admitted. "A pressure in the air. A mourning that predates even the heresy. You have done more damage with silence than 1,000 heretics have with fire." "Then kill me," she said. He didn't move. "No, not yet. I want to understand. What is it you seek?" Her answer was a whisper. "Redemption." He frowned. "You think we are unredeemed?" She nodded. "Even now?" even with the church reborn in blood and steel. Especially now, she breathed. The Inquisitor said nothing. Then, for the first time, he sat beside her, not as a judge, not as a tormentor, but as a man who no longer believed the answers he had memorized. Elsewhere, far from cathedrals and cloisters, aboard a pilgrim ship drifting through the sea of souls, the warp churned strangely. The vessel had carried relic seekers, missionaries, and 3 canonesses on sacred pilgrimage. Now it floated half dead, its Geller field failing. But the demons did not come. The warp raged and stormed, and then, in its midst, a stillness formed, a harmony. From the Vox systems, unbidden and unpowered, came a song. No voice had recorded it. No choir had survived to sing it. Yet it rang out, pure, aching, holy. A song for a God who never answered. A song for children lost in silence. And the warp recoiled. Back in the chapel of black veils, the candles guttered, the fresco cracked, and the face of the emperor, once hidden in sacred ambiguity, now seemed changed. To Hestera's eyes, it was as though a single tear had been painted down his cheek, but no painter had touched the mural in centuries. She blinked, unsure if she imagined it. "Mevelian," she whispered. The canoness rose. She had felt it too. Something had shifted. "This can't be coincidence." "No," said Mevelian. "It's awakening." "What is?" "Our conscience." She turned, not toward the altar, but toward the door. "We break her free tonight." And so, in the final hours of the day of sorrow, a holy commemoration of martyrdom, while the convent rang hollow with ritual lamentation and no one watched the lower vaults, Mevelian and Hestera descended into the earth with sanctified weapons and a key blessed by none. The air grew cold. The hymn Elanthe had carried in her heart now flowed through the stones themselves, and in the shadows, someone else had begun to listen. The vault doors beneath the convent sanctorum had no locks, only seals, scripture layered upon scripture, litanies etched in adamantine, wards designed not just to imprison flesh, but to bind the soul itself. Only a high canoness of the order or a sanctioned inquisitor could pass these seals without being seared by divine fire. Canoness Mevelian was neither, at least not anymore. She stood before the gate with Sister Hestera beside her, both wrapped in the shadows of rebellion and penitence. The incense on their robes still clung from mourning, prayers, mixing now with the cold iron scent of the underchapel's still air. Mevelian took the reliquary chain from around her neck, a relic gifted to her by Saint Lysandra's successors. She pressed it against the seal. The script flared once, not in resistance, but in recognition. For all her doubt, the seal still knew her. The gates opened with the sound of falling tombstones. Inside, chained by faith and iron, Sister Elanthe lifted her head. She did not speak at first. She had learned silence not as a burden, but as a gift. The silence that preceded understanding. The silence that followed grief. And now she saw 2 figures before her who bore both. Mevelian dropped to her knees. "Forgive me," she said. Elanthe tilted her head. "Not for doubting you," the canoness whispered, "but for believing the system that doubted you could ever be sacred." Hestera said nothing, but her hands worked fast, unlocking the manacles that held Elanthe's arms overhead. The metal fell like chains from an angel. Elanthe winced as her limbs lowered, the muscles long unused. "You'll need time to recover," Mevelian said. "No," Elanthe murmured. "There is no time." She stood slowly, as if the air had changed to something heavier, something holy. and around her, the hymn she'd carried within began to spill into the world again. Not sung, not spoken, but present. The walls of the vault did not shake. They listened. In the chambers above, Inquisitor Nidal Vara stood alone before the broken mask of the angel he once wore. His hand trembled as he held the Voxcaster relays to his ear. The hymn was spreading. Not through any channel he had authorized. Not through any technology he recognized. It was humming through the very bones of the convent. Across noospheric networks, through machine spirits, through the minds of sleeping sisters, and the hollowed minds of servitors alike. A prayer born of grief, a song for mercy, and something else. Something that made him weep. He dropped the Voxcaster. It hit the floor and splintered, and in that sound, he heard a child's voice. Do you remember us? The song did not halt the world, but it made the world pause. Across the stars, in the farthest reaches of the Imperium, sisters of battle reported dreams they could not explain, of choirs long silenced, of candles that burned without flame, of voices that asked not for war, but for remembrance. In a shrine world orbiting a dead sun, a statue of St. Praxedes cracked down the center, revealing within it a smaller, older carving, a child kneeling in prayer. No one knew who had placed it there. In the black ships, whispers moved through the cells of those gifted with the curse of soul sight. Children who had never known peace began humming the same haunting melody. The Inquisition issued an alert. Anomalous mimetic transmission. Origin unknown. Possible xeno or warp taint. But the Ordo Hereticus knew the truth. This was not an infection. It was a memory. Elanthe walked again. Each step she took through the halls of the convent brought another sister to her knees, not in worship, but in recognition. Some wept, some turned away, some simply watched. What passed between them was not absolution. It was grief, naked and unadorned. And Mavelian, once a pillar of doctrine, did not lead her. She followed. "Where are we going?" Hestra whispered. Elanthe stopped before a mural. It had been painted over long ago, a scene once deemed heretical. She reached out and touched it, and the paint peeled away. Beneath was not a scene of war or triumph, but of sorrow. The Emperor, not on his throne, but standing, holding a dying girl in his arms. No armor, no radiance, only pain. The hymn grew louder, and something ancient stirred. Deep in the vaults beneath Terra itself, where the choir of the Astronomicon maintained the psychic beacon that guided the Imperium, a stillness fell. A single astropath dropped his stylus. His eyes, long hollowed by warp sight, widened. "I hear them," he whispered. "Who?" the master choirist asked. "The forgotten." Before the question could be repeated, he collapsed. But as his soul departed, it sang, and the light of the Astronomicon flickered, only for a second. But in that second, the Emperor opened his eyes, just once, and wept. Inquisitor Vara stood now in the convent's nave, alone, surrounded by sisters who no longer raised weapons. They stood in uncertain defiance. Of him, of themselves, of what they once thought was unshakable truth. He saw Elanthe enter, and she did not stop. She walked past him, her hands open, her face peaceful. The hymn resonated now not just through stone, but through flesh. Vara fell to his knees. He did not feel defeated. He felt free. Later that night, in the chapel of Black Veils, Elanthe stood once more before the mural that now showed the Emperor holding the child. It was quiet, not silent, but quiet. The kind of quiet that follows grief. The kind of quiet where hope might one day grow again. Mevelian lit a single candle. "No one will believe us," she said. "They don't need to," Elanthe replied. "Then what happens now?" Elanthe looked toward the stars. "Now, we remember." The bells of the convent sanctorum did not toll that morning. No call to matins, no summons to penance, no thunder of ritual iron echoing down the vaulted halls. Only stillness, the kind of stillness that blankets a battlefield after the last shot is fired and before the first prayer for the dead is whispered. A stillness not of peace but of pause, where the old world holds its breath, uncertain whether it has truly died. In that silence, the sisters of battle moved as if in a dream. They had heard the hymn in their sleep. They had woken with tears on their cheeks and the names of long-forgotten novices on their lips. They had looked into the mirror and seen not warriors of flame and fury, but daughters. And daughters, when they mourn, do not weep for victory. They weep for the songs that were never sung. Canoness Mevelian entered the sanctum of the names, where the bones of martyrs were kept in silver cradles and incense never ceased to burn. She did not come to pray. She came to listen. The names carved into the walls spoke without voices, each one a life once bright, now cold. Elanthe stood already within, barefoot on the black stone floor, hands clasped before her like a child at confession. "They called it silence," she said, "but it was a burial." Mevelian approached slowly. "The records say your choir had been tainted. You were accused of invoking unsanctioned warp phenomena. We sang of mercy. Warp entities masquerade as compassion all the time." Elanthe turned, and in her eyes was no defiance, only a kind of unshakable stillness. "I do not ask you to believe in me," she said, "only to hear what the Emperor already knows." And then she sang. It was not a song made for mortals. It was a thread of sorrow so delicate it might have torn the ear that heard it. A melody that shimmered on the edge of thought, memory and pain. It spoke of children born to flame, of sisters burned on altars of bureaucracy, of choirs raised not to be heard, but to be silenced, and beneath it all, the memory of a golden man who once listened to them all. Mevelian dropped her knees to the stone, her breath stolen, not by beauty, but by grief. The song ended, and the silence afterward was not empty, it was full of ghosts. Elsewhere, far across the stars, the black ships that ferried psychers to the Golden Throne began reporting disturbances, not breaches, not attacks, but awakening. In their deep vaults, where the harvested souls of the Imperium's children awaited judgment or obliteration, new voices had begun to stir, unseen, unnamed, but remembered. The choir masters of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica called emergency conclaves. The Ordo Hereticus dispatched agents. One such ship, the Barrow of St. Cordia, broadcast a single signal across a dozen void frequencies before vanishing from the noosphere. The message was short, 3 words: "We are awake." Back in the convent, Sister Hestra walked the cloisters alone, her mind a storm of contradictions. She had once believed doubt was the enemy of faith, that the straightest road was always the surest, that obedience was a kind of holiness. But now she found herself staring at the murals on the walls, scenes of saints with flaming swords, martyrs impaled on banners, angels tearing open their own chests in sacrifice, and wondering what had been left out. She reached the Hall of Echoes and saw a sister kneeling before a shattered stained glass window. The window had once shown St. Praxedes immolating herself to light a cathedral. Now it was broken, and the light that poured through was soft, not searing. Hestera sat beside her. The sister turned. "Is this heresy?" "I don't know anymore," Hestera whispered, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of that answer. The Inquisition did not wait long. By nightfall, a black armoured ship hung above the convent, and within it stood a man with no name, only a rank, Lord Inquisitor Vassian Kell. He had silenced cults, burned libraries, executed cardinals. He did not ask questions to find truth. He asked them to find guilt, and guilt, in his eyes, was always already present. He stepped from his ship into the nave with an escort of skitari and sigh-dampening servitors, their presence like a blade across the soul. He was not here for discussion. He was here for correction. "Where is the traitor?" he asked. Mervelian did not flinch. "She is not a traitor." "Then you are." Kell stepped forward, vox amp humming low. "Canoness Mervelian, you are charged with harbouring a known heretic, permitting mimetic contagion, and permitting unauthorized liturgical deviation." The sisters in the nave stood still, their armour silent, their helms lowered. "I am charged," Mervelian said softly, "with remembering." Kell's eyes narrowed. "I will speak with the girl," he growled. "Alone." No, it was not Mervelian who said it. It was Elanthe. She stepped into the light from the apse above, barefoot still, clad in the simplest of habits. No armour, no weapon, only voice. And yet Kell stepped back, for the hymn had begun again. This time it did not stay within the walls. The hymn passed into the vox choirs, into the ambient data channels of the Mechanicus, into the air, into the stars, a song older than doctrine, one remembered by those who were never meant to live long enough to sing again. In the Schola Progenium, orphans began humming it. In the battlefields of Armageddon, sisters in the thick of war paused mid-firefight, tears falling behind their visors. And deep in the palace on Terra, one of the Emperor's custodians fell to his knees in the throne room, whispering, "I remember this." Lord Inquisitor Kell raised his hand. "Terminate the source," he ordered. The servitors advanced, but the sisters blocked their path, not with blades, with bodies, a wall of armoured devotion, not rebellion, but reverence. Kell reached for his bolt pistol and found it gone. Elanthe was beside him, holding it, not aiming it, just holding it, and singing. He dropped to the ground, clutching his ears, not from pain, but from what he heard. He saw himself as a child carried aboard the black ship. He saw his mother's face, her fear, her shame. He saw the choirs beneath the throne, and he saw something else, a small voice, a hand reaching toward his, a chance not taken. He wept, not because of the song, but because of what it gave back. That night, the bells rang once, just once, not to summon, not to warn, but to mark a moment, the moment when the hymn that had been forgotten was remembered again. In the cloisters of the outer sanctum, where once sisters walked barefoot over heated marble to feel the penance of their forebears, there now lingered only ash, not from fire, but from ritual, a silent, scorched path, where all warmth had been consumed in the name of purity. Canoness Mervelian stood at its threshold. She had walked this path before, when she was but a novice and had not yet seen a child burn for a song. But tonight, the marble was cold. The flames had gone out. "Is it an omen?" Sister Hestera asked, standing beside her. Mervelian did not answer immediately. Instead, she knelt and touched the stone. It was not just cold. It was lifeless. "No one has walked it today," she said. "No sisters, no trials, no repentance. It's as if the fire itself has turned its gaze away." Beneath them, in the hidden cellars where only the Inquisition was permitted to tread, the echo of song still trembled through the rock. Elanthe sat in her bonds, though they no longer bled. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved with no sound. The Inquisitor, no longer masked, no longer cruel, watched her. In his hand was a relic blade, not raised, merely held, a formality of power clutched by someone who now feared what it meant. "You're not chanting," he said. "No," Elanthe whispered. "I'm listening." "To what?" "To the spaces between the stars." He hesitated. "Do they speak to you?" She shook her head. "They remember." Elsewhere, word had begun to spread, quiet like a shadow slipping under a door, of sisters who wept in prayer and saw shapes in the wax of their votive candles, of confessors whose sermons grew quieter, of relics that cracked when touched, of silence that felt different, not empty, occupied. In the archives of the convent sanctorum, a novice named Varen discovered an entry long hidden, a record from the Quia Quietus, dated centuries before their silencing. It was not a chant, not a warning, but a dream. They had written of a time when the emperor would turn his face, not away in judgment, but downward in sorrow, when the cruelty of his servants would echo louder than their hymns, and when a voice, not sanctioned, not pure, but broken and grieving, would open the silence and bring fire that did not burn. Verene, trembling, took the scroll to the librarian's sacred incinerator, but the flames refused to touch it. The fire turned black, then cold. The parchment remained whole. She fled. That night, in the reclusium, Sister Illyra awoke screaming from a dream. "I saw him," she cried, "but not as gold or light or glory. I saw him buried in wires, held upright by sorrow. And he wept. He wept for us. No one dared soothe her, for all of them had dreamed the same." In the vaults, the Inquisitor asked Elanthe a final question. "Why does it begin with you?" She looked at him with hollow reverence. "It does not begin with me," she said. "It began with him, with his silence, and with the pain we poured into that silence. I am only the first who dared not run from it. What are you then?" She smiled faintly. "A lamentation." He stared at her. Then he stood. He did not draw his weapon. Instead, he placed the blade on the floor, and he left the door open behind him. Canoness Mavelian received the word in whispers. The cell was empty, the locks untouched, the chains severed not by tools, but by something unseen. She and Hestera stood above the cell, gazing into the dark void where Elanthe had been kept. "Did she escape?" Hestera asked. "No," Mavelian said. "She was freed." And in her heart, she knew it had not been a betrayal. It had been a prayer. Elanthe walked the path of ash with bare feet, but the stones no longer seared. She walked in silence, and the silence welcomed her. Above her, the great bells of the convent sanctorum had begun to ring, not by rope or automation. They rang on their own. They rang not for victory, but for mourning. All across the convent, sisters dropped to their knees. Some wept, some gasped. A few, like young Varen, simply listened. The echoes carried through the stone halls like a requiem, older than scripture. In the void of space aboard a battle barge of the Adepta Sororitas en route to a heretical purge, the vox screamed with static. And then, a child's voice, clear wordless, singing. The ship's confessor fell to his knees. One of the Palatine sisters tore the comms from its mount in terror. But the voice did not stop. It lived in the bulkheads, in the sanctified steel, in the grav tethers and shrine nodes. The ship drifted off course, away from its target, towards something else, something no longer silent. And in the warp, where gods and demons feast upon faith and fear, something ancient stirred. Not a god, not a demon, but a remembrance of a man who once loved his children, before they built a throne of silence around him, and his grief, denied for so long, began to bleed outward. In the dark vaults beneath the convent sanctorum, where the bones of long dead saints were held in silence and dust, a sound began to rise. Not voices, not screams, but harmony, low at first, like breath stirring through stone, like the murmur of forgotten dreams, but it grew steady and mournful, layer upon layer, like a cathedral of sound built without hands. The sisters did not know what to call it, but the oldest among them wept, because they remembered. This was the voice of the choir quietus, not as it had been, in shrieking, agony or sacred fire, but as it had once been, before the black ships, before the bindings, before the emperor's silence had been weaponized. This was a song not of war, but of grief and of memory. Elanthe wandered the outer halls of the convent, unchallenged. No sister raised a bolt gun against her. No canoness cried heresy. The relic armor statues turned their heads away. The purity seals on the walls began to curl and wither, as though ashamed of the prayers they bore. She passed through a cloister where a novitiate choir had once rehearsed hymns to burn the heretic. Now, no one sang. The air trembled, and her bare feet left no mark. In the reclusium, a sister superior named Malkira stood before the great golden statue of Saint Celestine. Her hands trembled. She had once stood at Celestine's side during a crusade in the Vortex Drift, where 1,000 souls had perished in flame. She had called it holy. She had believed the fire was justice. Now she could not remember their faces, only their screams. She reached toward the statue, as if to draw comfort, but the metal blistered under her touch. She drew back in horror, and behind her she heard it, the song. The Inquisitor returned to the chapel, though none dared ask why. He came not in shadow, not in fury, but in silence. In his hand was a single reliquary, not of a saint, but of a child, a small blackened skull, no larger than a newborn's, encased in golden filigree. The last voice of the choir quietus, he said, unburned, unbound. He placed it upon the altar, and the song grew louder. The ecclesiarch himself, far across the stars in the radiant domes of terror, was roused from slumber by dreams that tore through the mind like needles. He saw golden halls drowning in blood. He saw sisters kneeling in ash. He saw the throne flicker just once, and he awoke weeping. He demanded that the name Elanthe be purged from every registry, every record. But the scribes could not find it. Even the Inquisition's archives had gone blank. It was as if she had never existed, and yet the name remained in their mouths, their dreams, their guilt. Back at the convent sanctorum, the doors of the reliquary burst open, not by force, but from within. 100,000 sacred relics, bones of martyrs, hands of saints, tongues of prophets, all turned to dust. Only one item remained intact, a hymnal, unmarked, its pages blank. But when opened, the room filled with music, and the sisters who stood in that chamber felt their knees fail them, not from awe, from sorrow. because the melody was familiar. It was their own, sung centuries ago, in the early days of faith, before doctrine, before flame, before silence, before they had forgotten themselves. Sister Hestera found Canoness Mavelian alone in the chapel of judgment, kneeling before a shattered mirror. Her armour lay discarded, around her like old bones. Her hands bled from gripping her rosarius too tightly. "She is not the threat," Mavelian whispered. "We are." Hestera said nothing. Instead, she knelt beside her and listened. Across the stars, other convents began to fall silent. Not in death, in reflection. The Adepta Sororitas, forged in wrath, sculpted in sacrifice, began to remember another truth, that they had once been shepherds, not executioners, singers, not screamers, defenders of the weak, not just punishers of the corrupt. They had built cathedrals of fire, but forgotten why the fire was lit. Elanthi entered the chapel of the Veiled Dawn, where the choir lofts had remained sealed for a generation. She ascended without a word. The door swung open at her touch. Dust rose in beams of soft light. She stood before the ancient stone pulpit once used by the choir quertus, and there she spoke. Only one word, not a name, not a sermon, not a cry, just a note, a tone, clear and pure, like the first breath of a newborn. And from the walls, the stained glass windows, the bones of saints, and the black steel of sanctified bolt casters. The choir answered. They remembered themselves. The song spread across the stars, through no vox channel, through no warp gate. It moved through faith, through doubt, through pain. And the Imperium, vast and brutal, paused, just for a moment. And in that moment, the Emperor stirred, not fully, not with command or fury, but with grief. The Astronomicon flickered, and in that flicker, navigators across the segmentum solar collapsed in rapture. They saw not light, but tears, golden, infinite, falling through the warp like a requiem for all the children never returned. The fire still burned, on 1,000 worlds, in the name of purity, in the name of silence. But now, a different flame had been lit. It burned not to destroy, but to remember. And some sisters, when they walked the path of ash, no longer sought the pain. They listened to the silence and found music. It began with an absence. No thunder in the sky. No warp-churned shadows slithering into orbit. No towering spires of black adamantium descending upon the world like a blade. No screaming children dragged from their homes. No robes, no chains, no tears. Just absence. On the world of Patrona 9, where the tithe of Psychoborn had never once been missed since the founding of the Imperium, the sky remained calm. The villages that bordered the sanctuaries kept their children hidden, as always, behind cloth and prayer and fear. But the fear grew brittle with each passing day, and on the 7th day the bells of the ecclesiarchy tolled, but not for sacrifice. They tolled in confusion, and in the sanctuary of Saint Leothane, a child dreamed. Her name was Solmea. She was 7. Her hair was ashen white, not from age, but from the fires she had survived when her birth mother tried to end the curse the moment her eyes first shimmered gold. The flames had not touched her. They had danced around her, like a ring of mourning angels. The villagers whispered of it, called her witch child, warp-born, a danger, and they were not wrong. She had known thoughts not her own, heard whispers from dying birds, seen colours no painter could ever dream, but she did not speak of these things. She only sang. In the quiet of the sanctuary, Solmea sat before the icon of the emperor. His face, serene and terrible, gazed down from the golden mural. She sang a soft lullaby. It had no words. It did not need any. The priest who watched her, Father Brevin, had once served aboard a black ship as a chaplain. He had seen the bindings, heard the cries. He had watched children, barely older than Solmea, burn from within, screaming in every tongue ever spoken by mankind. He had never forgiven himself. And now, this child sat in silence, singing to the god emperor as if he was sleeping in a cradle above. And Brevin wept. On the 12th day, an astropath screamed in orbit, not in pain, but in awe. He beheld a corridor in the immaterium, a song winding like a silver thread through madness, and at the end of that thread, not darkness, not demons, not silence, but a voice, warm, weeping, calling home. The black ship that had approached Patrona Rasen and Aura X turned aside, not from fear, but reverence, and departed. News, like fire, could never be truly contained, especially not when it moved through the souls of psychers themselves. Across hive worlds, shrine worlds, feral worlds, everywhere the black ships cast their shadow, a quiet rebellion was kindled, not in war, but in waiting. Children who had been hidden in cellars and sanctuaries for generations began to speak of a woman of light who sang in the dark. They did not know her name, but they called her the Rememberer, and when asked what she remembered, they all answered the same, the voice that once called us home. On one industrial moon, where the Scholastica Psychona operated its most brutal training regimens, a child simply walked out. He was not stopped. He passed through locked gates and servo-skull checkpoints, through wards of nullification and rooms of pain, and he did not look back. When questioned, the overseers could not describe him. They only recalled one thing, the silence he left behind, not empty, full, like a cathedral waiting for a choir. Back at the convent sanctorum, the sisters gathered in the veiled chapel. Elanthe stood at the pulpit, surrounded by relics that no longer wept blood, but light. She did not command. She did not preach. She only asked one question. Do you remember who we were before the fire? Sister Hestera lowered her gaze. Canoness Mervelian knelt, and in the deepest vaults of the convent, a locked chamber sealed since the age of apostasy groaned open. Inside was a fresco, faded, ancient. It showed women in robes of white and silver, not black and crimson. They bore no bolters, only candles. They sang into the stars, guiding ships through storms with song alone. The fresco was unsigned, but its title was etched into the stone beneath. The First Choir. Within days, entire convents across the Segmentum Pacificus and Ultima Segmentum began to alter their rites, not fully, not yet, but some sisters set down their weapons during prayer. Others allowed psyker children to enter their sanctuaries, not as tithe, but as guests. A few even began to hum forgotten hymns from the time before the ecclesiarchal mandate codified silence as sacred. The Inquisition took notice, but they did not act, because even within the holy ordos, there were those who now dreamed of voices long silenced, and wept. On the shrine world of Benedictina, where 10,000 martyrs' bones formed the foundation of the basilica unquestioned, a sister Repentia halted her execution mid-blade. She had been prepared to die for her sins, but the child she was meant to slay looked up and sang a single note, a soft one, a lonely one, and the sister dropped her eviscerator and fell to her knees, and whispered, "I remember." The black ships continued to sail the stars, but some came back empty. Some refused their orders, some never arrived. And the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, in desperation, sought to understand. They opened the vaults of the silent archive, and in those tomes, buried under millennia of rot and seal, they found a fragment of doctrine. In the days before the tithes, when the choir was whole, the Emperor heard us clearly, a warning, a lament no one knew, but those who read it felt their minds ring with a dissonance too ancient to silence. The Imperium is vast, its inertia immeasurable. It does not change quickly, it does not change kindly, but it does remember. And now, like a seed long buried in ash, the choir quieter stirred, no longer silent, no longer forgotten. They would not return as they were, but as something new. Not saints, not martyrs, not weapons, but singers. And through them, the Astronomicon flickered, again. Not dimmer, brighter, only for a second. But across the galaxy, psychers felt it. A hand, reaching through time, through silence, calling them back. The wind howled through the broken rafters of the ruined chapel at St. Sabbath's pyre, a forgotten bastion swallowed by ash and silence. Once, it had been a place of songs and sermons, where sisters sang the litany of purity over the bones of martyrs. Now, only the wind prayed, and yet, within these desecrated walls, a miracle would soon unfold. One not written in gold ink or sung by choirs, but etched in blood and sacrifice. Canoness. Veritas, Helena knelt before the altar, though the altar itself was cracked in two, split by artillery shell or divine fury. Her armor was scorched, her fingers raw, her lips blistered by flame and fasting. For 5 days and nights she had neither slept nor wept, standing vigil over the wounded and the dying. The chapel's reliquaries had been pillaged by heretics, and the sisters of her command had been whittled to only 9. They had taken shelter here after the disastrous ambush at the Vale of Black Suns, dragging their wounded beneath a sky that wept black rain. But the Emperor was silent, and yet the silence was not empty. Sister Aurelia was the youngest among them, barely ascended from novitiate status, and it was her voice that broke the hush. "Canoness, they are coming again." From the broken doorway, Helena saw the shimmer of torches, too many. The traitor guard, the verdant spiral, marched beneath banners sewn from flayed ecclesiarchy vestments. They had brought tanks this time. She knew this would be the last stand. Helena turned not to her sword, but to the shattered bones in the reliquary. The fingers of Saint Audrina, the burned, long declared lost, had miraculously remained in the cracked sanctum, hidden beneath a fallen icon. She lifted the small fragment of bone, and its cold fire burned her hand. In that instant, time unraveled. Helena's vision was torn away, cast into a blinding haze of memory and prophecy. She saw the moment Audrina had fallen, consumed by pyre flames on Necromunda, singing the Emperor's name as her skin blackened. She felt the agony of that sacrifice, and then the ecstasy of becoming more, becoming vessel. The spirit of faith did not fade in death. It echoed, and Helena, in her suffering, was echo enough. She stood. The other sisters felt it instantly, a shift, a sacred chill. Helena's eyes now blazed with the cold fire of something more than zeal. The bone of the saint burned in her palm, and she raised it high as the first shell slammed into the chapel walls. Stone collapsed, glass shattered, and the heavens howled in kind. Yet amid this, Helena's voice rang out, "By his blood and by her flame, We are never truly silent. The sisters, bloodied and limping, formed ranks around her, not out of command, but communion. They sang, their voices ragged but radiant, calling on every martyr, every forgotten saint, every woman who had burned with purpose. The verdant spiral entered the chapel with mockery and laughter. They did not laugh long. Helena raised the saint's bone, and the floor of the chapel trembled. Statues shattered in spontaneous combustion. Icons wept blood. The air itself ignited with a sacred force neither psychic nor mundane. It was not sorcery. It was not technology. It was wrath, sanctified. A wall of white flame erupted, purifying traitor and sister alike. But the sisters sang through it, unburned, their armor and eyes gleaming like stars. The traitors screamed as the fire melted through ceramite and soul. When the firestorm ended, the chapel had become an ossuary of ash. Only 2 sisters survived the blaze, Aurelia, cradling the blackened corpse of Helena. But in Helena's chest, beneath shattered armor, the bone of Saint Audrina still glowed with unspent flame. The miracle was not just that they had survived. It was that they had transcended. Word of the event spread like wildfire through the Schola Progenium, across cathedrals and death worlds alike. Some claimed Helena ascended in that moment and joined the pantheon of living saints. Others said her voice could be heard, faint and fierce, in moments of great despair, especially among young novitiates. But for Aurelia, the truth needed no embellishment. Helena had not simply died. She had become the silence and made it sing. Long before the silence of the sisters echoed across 1,000 cathedrals, there was a time when their voices shaped the very stars. They were called the choir penitent, not a regiment nor an order, but a singular experiment born from a vision on terror itself. They were not trained for war, nor diplomacy, nor healing. They were not sisters famulus, nor hospitaller, nor militant. They were instruments. Vocal cords tuned with gene prayers. Lungs strengthened through holy alchemy. Minds stripped of doubt and filled only with litanies older than the Imperium itself. They were created to sing, but not to sing for beauty, nor to bring joy. Their voices were weapons. It was Lord High Confessor Xenobal who conceived the choir during the darkest days of the Second Charadon incursion. Worlds fell, astropaths bled from the eyes, and the warp grew fat with lies. On a shrine world orbiting a dead sun, Sanctum Oclor, Xenobal called upon the Ordo Hereticus and demanded sanction for a miracle. What emerged was a fortress monastery that housed no weapons but a single chamber, the Vault of Echoes. Within, the choir trained for 3 decades. Not one was permitted to leave. Not one was allowed to remember her birth name. They became Vox Incarnate, taught the forbidden psalms of the Emperor's gene saints, the scream litanies of the martyrs of Thessalonica, and the susurrus incantations of the silent basilica on Mars. They practiced until their voices could shatter plasteel, turn blood to vapor, and banish demons. But there was a cost. To wield such voice was to carry the ruin of the soul. Each time they sang, part of them burned away, not in flesh, but in faith. The choir did not age, but they withered. They did not bleed, but they hollowed. By the time of their first deployment to the Black Spindle Wars, only 18 of the original 40 remained whole. On the world of Vestia Vorn, their voices reduced an entire demon engine to slag in moments. No bolters, no fire, just psalms. But after the song ended, 3 sisters collapsed, never to rise again. Not dead, not alive, gone, their minds evacuated, their souls consumed by their own hymn. Still, the choir continued. Sister Veritas Igren was their leader, not by rank, but by resonance. Her voice was deep, low, almost inaudible to human ears. But when unleashed in full harmony with the others, her tone shaped the battlefield. She could bend sound like steel, carve trenches in rockcrete, or shatter vox nodes 3 systems away. She was called the still note, but even she began to falter. After Vestia Vaughan, she ceased speaking entirely outside of battle. Her thoughts were conveyed in sacred sign, or written in blood on parchment. She fasted for years. Some believed she was losing her humanity. Others said she was becoming something holier. She would be the last to fall. The final song of the choir penitent took place during the siege of the Crimson Bastion, when the heretic psychers of the Unshrouded Eye carved sigils into the warp and called forth an abomination known only as the Nameless King, a creature not of form but of echo, an entity that fed on oaths, promises and prayers. The presence of such a thing erased nearby psychers instantly. Battle chants fell to whispers. Even commissars found themselves unable to shout commands. No bolter could touch it. No blade could wound it. But a voice, a true voice, might silence it. The choir was summoned. No recording survives of the final battle. No Vox recording could have captured it. Those who witnessed the choir ascend the obsidian stairs of the bastion said they walked barefoot. No weapons, just robes, tattered and smoking with censers of ash. They sang not to the foe, but to each other. A harmony so perfect, so vast in scale and depth, that the stones beneath their feet cracked like ice. The Nameless King howled, but the sound was pulled apart by their tone. The choir did not scream, they did not shout. They chanted, unbroken, until the air around them caught flame and the bastion's walls caved inward, unable to withstand the vibrational purity of their unified devotion. In that moment, the Nameless King was forgotten. Literally, its name, its shape, its song, all erased. The Emperor's voice, through his daughters, had rewritten reality. When reinforcements arrived, they found the choir's bodies encased in crystallized dust, vocal cords fossilized mid-note, lungs collapsed like parchment scrolls. They had sung themselves into martyrdom. But at the very center of the vault, Igraine remained, silent, unmoving, alive. She never sang again. She was entombed within the Vault of Echoes, now declared an eternal sepulchre. Pilgrims travel there in solemn silence. Novices train nearby, fasting in her presence, praying before her motionless form in hope that, one day, she may speak again. None doubt that she hears them. For sometimes, only sometimes, when the chapel is empty and the wind is still, a single note can be heard. Low, pure, eternal. Tatititi amen meinit. The legacy of the choir penitent did not fade. Their sacrifice became a rite. Young sisters are now taught the first lines of their litanies, not to be sung but to be felt. In moments of utter despair, sisters have reported hearing fragments of the choir's final harmony. A battlefield drowning in blood may suddenly become quiet, not from fear, but remembrance. Their voices were weapons, but they were also promises, that no matter how dark the void, the song of the Emperor would endure. It is whispered among the scholar progenium that deep beneath the basilicas of Ophelia 7, there lies a vault no sister dares enter twice, a place not marked on star charts, nor named in any prayer, a chamber where sound itself dies. The vault is called the Hollow Sepulchre. This is where the silence was first entombed. not a place of rest, but a place of memory. Here the voices of the dead do not echo. Here, even the sacred canticles of the ecclesiarchy falter. And within this absence of sound rest the bones of the sisters who broke the stars with their song and were broken in return. This is where the choir penitent was buried. This is where silence became divine. The vault was commissioned by St. Calliora the Veiled, a sister of battle who had once been deafened by a sonic weapon during the pacification of Xanthi. She did not curse the affliction. She saw it as revelation, that silence was not absence, but clarity, that without noise, the soul could finally hear the emperor. She ordered the construction of the hollow sepulchre, using mute servitors and oath-bound artisans. Each stone was blessed in stillness, laid without chant, bound with sacred gestures in lieu of hymn. No sound was uttered during its building. The project took 50 years. When it was done, Calliora wept, not aloud, but in breathless reverence. She entered the sepulchre once. She did not return. Her bones now rest within its first chamber, beneath a slab of silver-grey obsidian etched with one line. In silence, we hear the emperor most clearly. The hollow sepulchre is more than a tomb. It is a paradox. The sisters who visit its halls do so barefoot, unarmed, and unaccompanied. They carry no data slates. They wear no powered armor. Even their rosaries are stripped of chains to prevent a single clink of metal. Each pilgrim is permitted to descend only once in her lifetime. Some never return, for within the sepulchre, the silence is alive. Scholars of the Ordo Ministorum speculate that the choir penitent's final resonance, the harmony that obliterated the nameless king, rippled outward not only through the warp, but into reality itself, that their sacrifice left behind a metaphysical wound, a place where vibration, sound, and expression have been stilled at the most fundamental level. And yet, in the center of the sepulchre lies a single relic, a crystal vial. Suspended within it, perfectly preserved, is one final breath of Sister Veritas Igraine. It is not sound, it is potential, stored in a stasis field encoded with prayer circuitry and adamantium scripture. This breath is considered the most sacred relic in all the orders of silence. It is never to be opened, never to be used, except in the case of the great drowning, a prophesied hour when all the voices of the Imperium shall be silenced, and only one may sing again to awaken the God Emperor from his throne of ash. None know who wrote the prophecy. It is not sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy, but the sisters believe. They believe because when a novice enters the sepulchre and reaches the relic chamber, she must kneel and listen. And every so often, a sister weeps, not from grief, but because she heard something. High Canoness Virel of the Argent Shroud once spent 5 days in the sepulchre. She left with bleeding ears and trembling hands. When asked what she had experienced, she offered only these words: "There is a silence beneath silence, a cathedral with no walls, where angels scream not in pain, but joy. We are not meant to hear it, and yet it calls. One day, it will return." She never spoke again after that day, but she lived another 40 years, guiding her order with unmatched serenity and insight. It was said she sang once more, just before her death. Legends now speak of Echo Daughters, young sisters born during thunderstorms on shrine worlds, whose voices resonate with unnatural clarity. These rare few are identified by the reverberant rite, a silent trial where a sister is placed alone in a sealed chamber filled with relics from the choir penitent. If the relics respond, if they tremble, hum, or crack, the sister is taken into the silent fold. She is trained not with bolter or blade, but with breath and balance, with ancient metered hymns forbidden to all others. She learns to wield not her voice, but the promise of it. She is taught never to sing unless called to by the emperor himself. Some call them a myth, others call them dangerous, but the Adeptus Astra Telepathica watches them closely. They fear the day one might actually sing. There are whispers, even among inquisitors, that the hollow sepulchre is not just a relic vault, but a seal, that the final song of the choir penitent did not destroy the nameless king, but entombed it, bound it in the folds of silence in a void deeper than the warp, that the sepulchre is not only a place of prayer, but a prison. If so, then the vial, the last breath of Igraine, is not a relic, it is a key, and one day a sister will be chosen to decide whether to use it. For now, the sepulchre sleeps. Candles flicker on the outer threshold, maintained by the silent vigil, a cadre of mute guardians who watch without rest, speak without sound, and pray without words. Their eyes are always open, their ears are always listening. Every now and then, a faint vibration is felt deep within the vault's lowest chamber. No alarm sound, but the candles begin to flicker in rhythm. To walk the halls of the hollow sepulchre is to face the truth few dare admit. That silence is not the absence of the emperor. It is his most sacred gift, his breath before the word, his stillness before the storm, his listening heart in a galaxy of screams. The choir understood. Igraine knew, and somewhere across 1,000 battlefields, when all vox traffic fails and bolters fall silent, a single note echoes on the wind, low, endless, waiting. There was a time, so long ago it now reads like myth, when the black ships moved in perfect cadence, each vessel a verse, each soul taken, a note, each scream, a necessary harmony in the dirge of survival. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica told themselves this was order, that the Emperor willed it so, that the harvesting of psychers was not cruelty, but sacrifice. But even among the sisters who boarded those ships, who walked the echoing halls where children wept themselves to sleep, there were some who listened too closely. They began to hear dissonance. Her name was Sister Threnodia, a seraphim of rare discipline, born on the shrine world of Cordus Sancti, where children were trained from infancy to sing the 9 canticles of absolution before they could even walk. Her voice was not merely beautiful, it was weaponized. A harmonic frequency so pure it could fracture crystal and pacify beasts driven mad by warp exposure. She was sent to accompany the black ship Obex Mortalis on its decade-long harvest across the Segmentum Pacificus. She was not the first sister to walk among the condemned, but she would be the last to leave in silence. In the lower decks of the Obex, far below the chanting Navigator Saint and Vox Towers of coded absolution, Sister Threnodia heard something strange. Not the screams, not the prayers, not even the warp wail of the damned. She heard a lullaby. It was faint, impossible, a melody in no known language, sung by no voice, whispered by no mouth. She searched the holding cells, the medici pits, even the sensory null chambers where the psychers with the most unstable gifts were stored in amniotic stasis. Nothing. Yet the song persisted, and worse, it began to respond to her. As she sang back, at first a single note in the key of Saint Dolore, a harmless test, the lullaby shifted, matched her note, then enveloped it. She sang again, so did it. They harmonized, and the ship began to bleed. warp breach was detected not long after. The navigator claimed he saw eyes open in the immaterium, not demonic, but weeping. The astropathic choir collapsed in unison, not screaming, but laughing in madness. The vox cantors began repeating one phrase across all channels: "She is not alone." The silence remembers. The silence sings. Sister Threnodia descended into the null chambers and found a child. She was no older than 6, a girl whose mouth was sewn shut not by thread but by psychic will. Her eyes bled softly, yet she wept no tears. She did not speak, but her presence hummed. The song was coming from within her, not her mouth, not her lungs, but from some deep buried memory that echoed not in the flesh, but in the soul. Threnodia knew then. This child had been born of silence, not simply a psyker, but a resonant, a rare soul attuned to the same frequency as the choir penitent, a living echo of a song long forbidden. She took the child in her arms. The moment she did, the ship stopped, literally. Engines ceased. The Geller field pulsed once, then dimmed. The ship floated through the void in perfect, impossible stillness. All around it, the warp withdrew, and for the first time in recorded history, a black ship fell silent. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica tried to cover it up. They claimed the Obex Mortalis was lost to a Geller malfunction, that its crew was annihilated, that no survivors remained. But Threnodia returned, carrying the child. No ship, no escort, no explanation. She walked barefoot through the spires of terror, straight into the heart of the Astronomican's vault. And there, without ceremony, she sang. What happened next is forbidden, but fragments remain, scribbled in the margins of books long burned, carved into the bones of those who dared remember. It is said the Emperor's corpse stirred, that for one heartbeat the Astronomican flared with a new kind of light, not the cold brilliance of starfire, but a warmth that sang of tears and memory. It is said the custodians wept, and that the child was taken, not by the Astra Telepathica, not by the Inquisition, but by the Sisters of Silence themselves. They named her Ecolette. She was raised not in the Schola, but within the chambers of the hollow sepulchre. The silent vigil taught her the ancient gestures of the choir, the rhythms of forgotten psalms, the metered breath of the word that was lost. She never spoke, but wherever she went, candles bent toward her. Stone relics vibrated in her presence, and when she laid her hands on the tomb of Igraine, the last breath within the stasis vial fluttered, just once, enough for the vigil to take notice. There is one more tale, whispered only in the vaults of those who no longer fear death, that Sister Threnodia vanished not long after Ecolette's naming, that she did not die, but ascended, that she became the song itself, a lingering frequency that haunts warp storms, that sings across the void to lost sisters, guiding them home, that her voice now echoes in every battle where a sister falls without scream, without cry, but with lips parted in reverent silence. And in those moments, if you listen closely, you will hear a note. Not sorrow, not rage, but promise. The black ships continue their harvest, but some among their ranks now wear a symbol not sanctioned by the Imperium, a tiny obsidian teardrop etched with a single line. She sang and the stars answered. They say it is a heresy. They say it is a rebellion. But those who wear it know. It is a prelude to something old, to something forgotten, to something that has not yet finished singing. The galaxy burned, worlds drowned in heresy, Hive cities wept molten tears, and the void itself screamed with warp-born echoes. But in the heart of the Imperium Nihilus, beyond the reach of the Astronomicon, where no light guided and no hope endured, there remained one place untouched by madness, a cathedral, floating in perfect orbit around a dead star, nameless, unmarked on any chart. Within it, silence reigned, not the silence of emptiness or fear, but of something deeper, older, a choir silenced. They were the last, not merely the last sisters of battle, nor even the last remnants of the choir that once sang to guide the golden throne. They were the last memory of a promise broken. 5 of them remained, clad in armor scorched black by time and fire. Their names had been lost even to them. They had taken oaths of muteness, not out of piety, but out of grief. They had watched empires fall. They had borne the death cries of saints, primarchs, and even gods. And now they stood in the sanctuary of echoes, a vast chamber lined with the skulls of psychers who had once sung the Astronomicon into being. Each skull inscribed with a single word: hope, burden, obedience, sacrifice, lament, and all of them silent. The central sister approached the dais. Upon it, a single relic remained, a shard of the original golden throne, wrapped in silver chains, its surface still humming with a psychic vibration too subtle for instruments to register, but too loud for souls to ignore. This fragment had not seen terror in millennia. It had been taken in secret when the choir fractured, when the Emperor's most hidden sins were revealed to those who had once loved him most. The last sisters of the choir knew the truth, that the Astronomicon was not merely a lighthouse, it was a prison, not for demons, but for something beneath even them. A memory stirred. The youngest among them, once named Sister Procida, had been but a novitiate when the revelation came. She remembered the day the choir screamed in unison, their song interrupted mid-hymn, blood pouring from eyes and mouths. Something had moved beneath the throne, something that remembered its name. And in that moment, tens of thousands of psychers had died. The choir was torn asunder. The black ships stopped arriving. The silence began. Not peace, not death, but a waiting silence, a held breath. Now the 5 sisters gathered around the relic. They did not speak. Their silence had power. Where once their voices had kept the Astronomicon lit, now their silence guarded the last truth of mankind, that the throne no longer held the Emperor, that he was gone, that they were all that remained to pretend. They knelt as one. 5 sets of armored hands reached to the relic. They touched it, and they began to sing. No ears would hear them, no record would remain, but the warp trembled. Across the galaxy, psychers fell to their knees. Navigators screamed into the void. Astropaths convulsed and saw visions of a flame extinguished by a woman's tear. And on Terra, deep beneath the palace, the golden throne gave a single, shuddering crack. The sisters' voices did not call for war, nor vengeance, nor even salvation. They sang of sorrow, of memory, of what could have been. They sang of the Emperor, not as god or tyrant, but as a man, a father, a betrayer, a dreamer. Their hymn was a eulogy for an empire that had never been allowed to grieve. When the last note faded, so did they. The sisters did not fall dead. They vanished, flesh, soul, and song, into the fragment of the throne. And the fragment crumbled, dust on the dais, silence once more. But this time, a healing silence, a sacred hush. And so the galaxy spun on, blind and burning. But in the minds of a few, just a few, there was a memory of a song they could not name, of a voice they had never heard, of mourning, and of women who had once sung for all of humanity, and in the end sung only for love.